by their title, so Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, etc. The other thing is timing, which by now you all know is a minute of protected time at the beginning and end of the speech. I'll be clapping twice at 7 minutes to signal to the speaker to please wrap up, and 3 times at 7 minutes and 15 seconds, after which I will wave at you and stop taking any further notes. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to begin today's hearing.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'll be providing you with a lot of contextualization. It will lack a few things. It will lack the sort of, can I restart? I'm in a heavy room here. Mr. Speaker, what I'm going to present to you today is not going to be alternative facts. It's not going to be extreme betting. And it's most definitely not going to be the sort of policies that Obama had created, Mr. Speaker. We think that we're dealing with an extremely stubborn man, a man who's unable to sort of commit to any sort of bipartisan agreement with any individual. We think that's extremely important to understand in today's debate. That we're dealing with a stubborn individual who isn't going to be willing to do any sort of give and take sort of relationship. So that is extremely important within today's relation. He's a man who takes what he wants and wants what he gets. And that's how his policy is premised. We've seen it by his executive orders. We've seen it by his radical sort of bombing in Syria, his radical bombing. We can say it's justified. We used the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan 2 weeks ago. We've seen it in these sort of actions, and we think they're just too rigorous. But I think a lot of contextualization is needed in today's debate. First of all, right, what do we mean when we speak about blocking? We speak about any act, right? Sit-ins, a vote of no confidence, a vote against a specific bill or policy. We think that block-ins are any form of action against the Trump administration, right? Secondly, what is a vote? We think that a vote is an extremely important part of today's debate. We think that a vote is sort of agreeing or consenting to a specific policy being the sort of overall policy that governs the country. So basically you're saying that you buy into this and it's going to affect sectors like healthcare, it's going to affect your sort of military, it's going to affect sectors like education, right? So I think I've done enough sort of contextualization. We know we're dealing with the Democrats, we know we're dealing with the GOP, right? Mr. Speaker, what I think is also important is just a brief recent historical analysis in terms of the Obama administration, right? We think that Obama was a bipartisan, a centralist. He was able to make certain concessions for the betterment of the country. We don't think that's going to be the case. We think that in the Trump administration, he's already shown, like I mentioned in my introduction, that he isn't going to be willing to take a step back. He is never going to be willing to sort of give and take and have a sort of quid pro quo relationship with other politicians. You know, sort of say, listen, I'll give you an extra clause in my policy that specifically deals with the minority, specifically deals with Hispanics, specifically deals with Mexicans. We've seen that he's unwilling to engage in these issues in the first place, Mr. Speaker. So we're dealing with a man who's completely different to his predecessor. Secondly, in terms of what the difference is, we think that in terms of just his international relations, I mean, he puts down the phone on the president of Australia. He's a man who makes irrational decisions and on a whim. And we think that it's extremely, extremely obvious when you see his main advisors and people close to him constantly having to defend statements such as alternative facts, these sort of bewildering statements that he makes that his team have to constantly, Steve Bannon has to constantly find himself strategically maneuvering a way out of that, right? So, Mr. Speaker, secondly, firstly, in terms of my substantive matter, I want to speak about the Trump administrative and the fact that he's willing to change America, but only for the bad. Like we've seen from his entire campaign speech, right? Building a wall, sort of having sort of less Hispanic or minority rights, sort of marginalizing any group or homosexuals. So he's always willing to change, and we give him that. But we think that his change is just too much for what America for itself stands for, right? We think that America stands for these sort of liberal, sort of accepting norms, and we think that this is now leading to other politicians all across the world. Marine Le Pen, who's taken up the sort of nationalistic agenda that he has as well. We think that this is quite important to accept and to understand, Mr. Speaker, right? So we think that he's trying to change America too rigorously, and this is extremely important to understand within today's debate, right? So we think that if we don't oppose every single thing that he does, at least in principle, and to make some sort of act in whichever realm or space, we don't necessarily think it's only limited to the House House of Representatives or the GOP. We think that this is in any case where one of Trump's policies are going to be implemented and are definitely going to be marginalizing someone. Yes, Yash?
Do you think an ideal Trump tax policy which removes money from the rich and big corporates is something that Democrats also want to achieve?
Mr. Speaker, we think that the Democrats have a clear, and in terms of the way that they're going to proportionally deal with taxes, Mr. Speaker, we think that the majority of taxes are going towards these sort of policies such as building a wall. They're not going towards any sort of education. It's going sort of policies that are going to be largely marginalizing sort of the more minority groups in the country. We don't think that the way that he is willing to do this is definitely going to be something that's going to be problematic. But the most important actor within today's debate, I think, is going to be the black American, right? We've just seen, as any sort of black individual across the world, a black man standing for the sort of values that they've worked about 250 years to achieve, right? So we think that the black American is going to be the most largely affected group. Mr. Speaker, if you look at his cabinet, if you look at the people that he even has, his only black advisor was willing to say that colonialism was something that was fine, and the way that people were shipped to America was something that was acceptable, and something that even him as a black person, he co-ops black people and sellouts. Mr. Speaker, we think it's extremely important to understand that everyone around him are white supremacists. Everyone around him are people who have these ideals, because he isn't someone who's willing, like I've been mentioning, to ever take a step back. They need to show us any policy since Trump has come in where he hasn't at all adhered to anything. When the High Court in America declared his order to be invalid and unconstitutional, he said we'll continue to fight it. He's someone who's never ever willing to concede, and if we don't take a principled stand against him, it will be something that perpetuates itself, right? So whether this man finds the black Democrat and the sort of minority groupings, right? We think that the minority groupings only find any sort of expression in America through these votes and through these sit-ins and through these sorts of blocks that they can take, right? And if they don't take these measures, there will never ever be any other way, because he isn't willing to sign a single bipartisan agreement in his first 115 days as being president. He's never ever been willing to at any point take a step back, and we think that's going to be something that's extremely important and disastrous for the black, for the Hispanic, for the homosexual, for any sort of marginalized group that were finding necessary strides. For instance, his recent decision in terms of homosexuals and the fact that he disagrees with some of the policies and the movement in terms of the progress in terms of these homosexuals is extremely problematic. So we've told you that a block is any form of block, Mr. Speaker. We've told you that legislation is something that is any sort of legal norm. We've also told you that a vote is an explicit act of saying that you stand or disagree with something, and that's why a vote in this context is extremely important. With that, I'd like to thank you.
I'll thank the speaker. Please don't echo the other speakers during speeches and trying to keep noises to the minimum. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the leader of the
Mr. Speaker, we regret the toxic politics of oppositionism, that you should support us because we are not the other guys. We think that we should take a moderate stance as the Democrats, that we should stand for moderation, that we should stand for the interests of our voters. Two issues in this speech. First of all, why there's a moral necessity and a necessity as a political party to be willing to entertain some legislation proposed by a different political party. Second of all, how Trump is empowered by this sort of decision and how the Democrats actually lose out as a result. So first and foremost, let me do some rebuttal. They talk about the idea that Trump will never compromise. Well, we don't think that's true. Trump changes positions all the time, often in ways that are compromising. Good example, look at Obamacare, for example, and his new Trump Care, in which he substantially moderated against radical Republicans in favor of things like not excluding people ever on the grounds of pre-existing health conditions. We think Trump markets himself as someone who's willing to make deals who's willing to make compromises in order to get a favorable agreement in the long run. We don't think we can never negotiate with Trump, but additionally, we think that Trump is realizing this as he is seeing that he's got problems within his own Republican Party, and he's going to need to seek allies and seek compromise elsewhere. So we think in the long run, he's even more likely to negotiate. We don't even think we need to deal with this, though, because if he proposes a piece of legislation that we consider to be acceptable, for example, things like protecting US jobs, we think could be quite unobjectionable in some circumstances. We think things like fostering trade agreements, dealing with China, dealing with Russia, could be quite unobjectionable in some circumstances. We think we have a duty to support those. What they have not told us is why it is necessary morally to oppose everything he does in order to get across the position that we're against the bad things. We think actually it's a hell of a lot more effective if you say we don't support the racism, we don't support the wall. It's much more effective to say that if you're not also saying we don't like policies that keep jobs in the United States. Then it just looks like you're opposing everything, as opposed to giving a clear moral objection to the worst things and the things that are actually objectionable. So, why is it wrong to do this on the part of a political party? Because a political party's legitimacy is derived from them protecting the interests of their electorate. We think it would be a betrayal of their electorate if they chose to go against everything Trump stood for, if the particular thing they were going against was in fact in the interests of the Democrats, right? What we would say is that the only way that their side of the house would be justified is if they believed that most of the Democrats just supported that party because they hate Trump and they want to oppose Trump in any way. That's not the case. There are a lot of Democrats on the margin, and there are a lot of Democrats with very serious, legitimate interests, and we think if you forego those interests when you have the option to defend them, that you are not an acceptable political party, and you're certainly not one that is behaving appropriately. Second issue, why does this actually empower Trump? And here I've got 6 reasons. The first thing is it empowers his anti-establishment rhetoric that the establishment doesn't want progress, that they're going to be a barrier to any sort of legislation that's in the interest of people because of petty politicking. You play into his anti-Hillary rhetoric, you mean it's less likely that the Democrats win in future. Additionally, you alienate your electorate, and especially people on the margins who moved to vote for Trump, who previously voted for Obama, which is why the Democrats won previously. You alienate those people because they're not so radically against the other side, and when you're not making decisions, not making concessions that protect their interests because you just want to oppose Trump, I'll take closing in a moment, those people are less likely to take you seriously as a political party, less likely to believe you serve their will. Yes?
Honestly want to run in this debate that the problem with the Democratic Party in 2017 is that they're too radical?
No, I think the problem with them is that they're idiots, right? And one of the ways in which they're idiots is that they just oppose Trump in every way. A big problem is that they've latched on to a bunch of other people that moderate people in the US hate, and because those people are aligned with the Democrats, the people who are always against conservatives, we think people actually buy into the conservative narrative because they hate those other people, and we don't want to buy into that sort of politics. Additionally, what we would say is that in politics, what you often do is you trade agreements, right? You say, we are willing to vote along these lines on this issue if you are willing to vote along our lines on a different issue. That's an important part of the political process, and one that we think Trump's going to be willing to do, especially when he's found that the Republicans aren't going to back him on everything, right? We think there's a lot of opportunity to make those kind of trade-offs that can ensure that minorities are protected, that can ensure that people with pre-existing conditions are not left behind by Trump care. We think that's something that is responsible, and a political party has a duty to do that. You can't get everything that you want, but we think it's better for political parties to get some of what they want, rather than condemn people to wait for 5 years until maybe the Democrats win, which they're less likely to do as a result of this sort of action. Additionally, what we would see is that it encourages damage to political institutions. When you've got a situation where parties are unwilling to accept any legislation, it encourages political reform that means that you have a less competitive system, that means that whoever's in power is able to get across across whatever reforms they wish, which we think is a bad thing. We like the existence of things like a filibuster for extreme circumstances where legislation is evil, but we don't want a situation where you oppose everything, and so just practically there's the political will to remove those kinds of institutions. Additionally, what we would say is that Trump needs now to pander to radical Republicans whose support he hasn't got with all of his legislation in the past. Most notably, Trumpcare. The reason he wasn't able to get it through was that the radical Republicans thought it was too liberal, and the liberal Democrats just didn't vote along with it because they hate Trump. Huge problem, because Trump has the option of pandering to radical Republicans and getting worse in order to get more legislation through. Something we think is dangerous, right? He's gone back on things like building the wall, and we think that that requires us to continue to work with him, and working with him is better. Additionally, when you oppose everything, you lose your capacity to operate as a member of civil society in opposing bad things, right? Republicans and even other Democrats consider you less persuasive when you stand up to oppose everything someone does, rather than to pick the battles that are most significant. Whenever they hear the Democrats come on the news, they just think, well, the Democrats always oppose Trump, and they don't take them seriously, something that we think is happening and should not be allowed to continue. For all these reasons, absolutely mad proposition, very happy to oppose.
Oh, thanks, Dr. Speaker. Now I'd like to welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
It's well known that had Bernie Sanders opposed Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders would have won the election. We think that's the kind of Democratic Party we want, and that's the kind of Democratic Party we should work toward. Moderate Democratic Party is a Democratic Party of the past that won't be able to defeat Trump. But a Democratic Party that will be able to defeat Trump is a radical Democratic Party, a Bernie Sanders Democratic Party, and we argue we only move toward that on our side of the case. That's what I'm going to do in my speech. But first, let's look at some rebuttal. Firstly, he said that this will make the Democratic Party seem less progressive, and allow Trump to continue pushing his anti-establishment agenda, and how the Democratic Party is against progress. We don't think this is true. I think that the general American voter will be able to understand that Bernie Sanders is definitely for progress, despite the fact that the Democratic Party constantly votes against Trump. We think the interpretation that most voters will get is that these people are against Trump, and Trump specifically. We doubt that the interpretation will be that they're against establishment in general. We think it's really odd for an American to think that Bernie Sanders would be against rigorous change to a country. We don't think any kind of person in America would make that kind of way up just because the Democratic Party is voting against different policies. We think that they're more likely to make their way up, that people are simply against Trump himself. And we think that the reason for that is we've seen a massive movement against Trump. We've seen protests against Trump. We think it's a more reasonable conclusion for the average voter to think this is them being against Trump and not them being against progress. We don't think that's true. But moreover, we think that in terms of the another argument they brought up, how absolutism will just be viewed negatively. Like on television, they're just a party that opposes everything. We think the average American voter is more likely to think that they're opposing Trump. We think there's a massive movement against Trump already. We think that they're jumping on that bandwagon. We think the average voter is more likely to interpret it as a move against Trump, and not a move against policy, or even a move against establishment, or even a move against progress. We think the average American voter is more likely to make that way up than a way up against policy in that regard. Next, he says that you alienate moderates. We like this for two reasons. Firstly, we force moderates closer to the left. We think a moderate is more likely, if they're anti-Trump, to want to have to support someone like Bernie Sanders to prevent Trump from getting into power. Otherwise, because of the nature of American politics whereby you only have two parties, if you're moderate and you've been alienated by the Democratic Party, you'll still see Trump as the greater evil than someone like Bernie Sanders, and you're still more likely to opt into the Democratic Party. It's not like you won't get them as supporters anymore. Even through that alienation, you force them to opt into more left policies because they're forced to be part of the Democratic Party because they see it as a lesser evil. So we're finding that alienation of moderates. We think it's necessary for the transformation of the Democratic Party to something that is far more to the left. We alienate the moderates until they join us. We think that's particularly powerful, and we think that's really important. But I understand that the analysis that he was actually giving us is that by alienating moderates, you're betraying your constituent. But I'm going to tell you in my positive matter why we think that's not true. So thank you. Next, he told you how Trump is actually someone who might compromise. Firstly, he flip-flops. Secondly, he paints himself as someone who has to make deals. No, thank you. And thirdly, he needs allies. We think on the first one, we don't think he flip-flops because of the Democratic Party. We think he most likely flip-flops because of Ivanka Trump or Jared Kushner or his advisors, or the fact that his brain told him to flip-flop on any day. We still think he will vehemently oppose the Democratic Party, which is the analysis you got from my Prime Minister's speech. It was that he is not a bipartisan person. It's not that he doesn't change his mind. We think whatever makes him change his mind is a nice thing, but we don't think that means that he's open for bipartisanship simply because he flip-flops because of some random act of nature. Secondly, he's a deal maker, is what he advertised himself as, but he also advertised himself as a person that knows everything. We don't think advertising yourself in a certain manner necessarily makes you so. And then finally, the idea that he needs allies. We think this is really important, and we think this is also something I'm going to touch on in my positive matter, how this actually strengthens the Democratic Party in Trump's eyes, because if they vehemently oppose everything, Trump has to start accommodating the Democratic Party, but you'll get that. Next, he tells us how you weaken political institutions because they become less competitive. Now, we think that we understand what he's saying here. He's saying that there will no longer be compromises. But he actually has to respond to my Prime Minister's analysis to show you that Trump never wanted to compromise with the Democratic Party in the first instance. And so it's current status quo that you aren't getting any of that political competition. You aren't getting a competitive policy. We think if Trump adds something to his policy, he's more likely to bring the outside people in, the anti-establishment people, the Jared Kushners, the Steve Bannons in to interpret and change his policy that needs to make allies with the Democratic Party. So you don't get any bipartisanship. If he goes out and reaches allies, he'll just go into the world of business, into the world of Wall Street, into the world of whatever swamp he got his entire Congress from. We think that that's what Trump is likely to do. So we don't think that this competitiveness exists in status quo currently. If it doesn't exist in our model, we think that that's something we're willing to accept to. Two things I want to speak about. No, thank you. Three things, rather. Firstly, how the status quo weakens the Democratic Party. Secondly, how there's an obligation the Democratic Party has to its constituents. And thirdly, how the Democratic Party is going to win. On this first one of how the Democratic Party is weakened currently. Firstly, votes are remembered. Whatever we do now will be remembered in the future. We think that this is what was brought up during Hillary Clinton's campaign. How she voted in the war and how she voted on economic reforms in America that were Republican helped her lose votes. Lots of people refused to vote for Hillary Clinton simply because she opted into policies that they didn't agree with. In the future, if a Democratic person wants to run for president, I'll take you in a second, they will be refused by their constituents simply because they voted for a Trump policy. But that's important. Yes?
If you think that the Democratic Party can take advantage of captive voters, why did Hillary Clinton lose on swing voters who were largely working class?
Well, because of the fact that she voted on Republican policies that those swing voters didn't appreciate. That's the analysis I've just given you. Next, we tell you that the Democratic Party is already split in current status quo. What does this mean? It means there's a massive push within the Democratic Party to reform this party and move it to more of a left party. Within the push has woken up a lot of individuals that weren't even Democrats before and were apathetic Americans to want to support people like Bernie Sanders who want to push for rigorous change. So we think there's a current split within the Democratic Party, and we'd rather be on the side of the split that pushes for progressive change. Next, what obligations do political parties have to their constituents? And this will directly respond to what David told you. We'd say Democratic Party constituents right now are vehemently anti-Trump and want nothing to do with Trump, regardless of any good policy that he might even have, if he does have any. His constituents don't want Trump. There was, on the day that he was inaugurated, there was a massive movement and march against Trump. There were people saying that Trump must have a motion of no confidence, that Trump must be impeached. There were movements by the constituents of the Democratic Party to reject anything that is Trump-related, regardless of what that policy wants. We'd argue that you only represent your constituents accurately when you become a political party that behaves the way your constituents do. And in this case, the constituents are vehemently and absolutely against Trump. We think that that's something you have to engage with. That's the constituents of the Democratic Party, and that's where you get your true representation. But finally, let's look at how the Democratic Party will win again. We think constituents in the Democratic Party are themselves moving away from bipartisanship. They don't want this. They're rejecting Clinton for her bipartisanshipness. They rejected Cory Booker for voting on the pharmaceutical bill that was somewhat Republican. We think that's particularly important. We think that constituents are absolutists. And if the Democratic Party wants to win, it must become an absolutist itself. Its constituents want radical reformation and change. They want Bernie Sanders, and that's what we should support in today's debate. I'm proud to propose.
The problem with a culture of outrage is that it normalizes that outrage itself. You lose the ability to use it as a tool, and as a result, politics and resistance gets worse. What we've told you is how politics gets worse on our side of the house, on their side of the house, when you have a blanket response to any policy that Trump possibly proposes, even ones that are good, even ones that are catered towards making compromises for the kinds of groups that you as the Democrat Party may represent. That hasn't been engaged with by the opening government yet. All they've done is tell us that Trump is necessarily bad, and we don't think that deals with the reality that Dave has brought you in contextualization. The reality in the United States is a class of swing voters who felt largely alienated by the fact that their interests were not being represented by either side of the political spectrum, by being working class and white at the point at which the Democrats abandoned the working class in favor of educated elites in places like Silicon Valley and like Boston, Massachusetts. What we tell you then is that the interests of those people need to be represented and recognized by the Democratic Party if they want to regain political influence at all. In order to do that, they need to recognize the fact that Trump at the moment represents some of those groups' interests because he was elected by them. In fact, opinion polls show that he hasn't actually lost support with this key constituency subsequent to being elected. This means that the Democrats have a reason, a mandated reason, in order to engage with and compromise on these groups, if they on these kinds of issues, in order to ensure that actually they act in a way that is consistent with their duties as a political party. What do we tell you the comparative is on our side of the house? We tell you, firstly, that selective opposition is much more effective than blanket opposition. So you can oppose the things that are abhorrent. So at the point at which they are saying things like slavery is acceptable, we're happy to say the Democrats can reject that statement. But that doesn't mean they should reject all statements that are being made by Trump. In fact, what it says is that it makes it more effective to reject the statements sometimes, because then you can say, oh, well, it's actually a bad thing. Not, well, the Democrats always say it's a bad thing that Trump did without the Democrats ever thinking about that carefully. But secondly, what we tell you as our comparative is that you get compromise. When you have compromise, you're more likely to have more of the interest of the Democratic voter being recognized by Republicans than you do on the comparative. But additionally, you're more likely to have more moderate versions of Republican legislation being implemented, which is better than an alternative where the Republicans use the majorities that they have in order to push through legislation that is more radical and more towards the Republican side. So we think compromise is better in both situations. So what's the impact? Well, if there's less compromise, you get reduced ability for the Democrats to push through moderate kinds of legislation now in the next 5 years while they don't have majorities in any of the legislative bodies in the United States. Secondly, it increases the risk that if the Democrats only win by a slim margin in the future, that the Republicans are going to reprise with this exact same strategy against them in the future, and they'll be less able to get their policies through then. Thirdly, what it does is it means that fewer Republican policies that are harmful in the present get passed, and that means that you get undermining of the kinds of institutions that Democrats are then going to have to invest in more if they do come to power in the future, and it harms the country in a way that we think is morally abhorrent. We don't think it's right to harm citizens within your country with legitimate needs in order to gain political support in the future. So, finally, we think that 5 years of deadlock is something that harms society as a whole. When you don't have any kind of ability to react to legislation in ways that are necessary, for example, if the economic situation changes and we need to legislate in order to buttress people's welfare packages to respond to that, and we block that, we think that's an abhorrent way to operate within society. Finally, in terms of clarity on this idea of Bernie Sanders, what what we would tell you is that the Democrats are moving away from Sanders in favor of revitalizing the party. We don't think it's relevant in today's debate. Additionally, if you really care about working class voters who resonated with Bernie Sanders, some of those people ultimately were captured by Trump, and as a result, we should be recognizing and compromising with Trump in order to make sure that the Democrats are recognizing the interests of the working class in the way that you would like to have us believe. Why do we think this is bad for the politics of opposition and specifically the politics of moderation? Firstly, what we tell you is that what happened with the rise of Trump was that the anti-establishment kinds of movements were empowered because it seemed like the establishment wasn't getting anything done. A large portion of the reason why this happened is because of deadlocks in American legislature-making entities. When that happens, what you do is you empower more radical anti-establishment parties, so you reduce the ability to have politics of compromise in the future if you encourage this kind of deadlock. Additionally, what we tell you is that this kind of polarized rivalry creates this kind of psychological belief that voters have to support their bloc because the people on the other side are never going to recognize their interests, never going to make any compromises to help to protect them. And in those cases, what you have is a Republican voter who is so afraid of Democrats who are never going to vote for their interests, block anything, even if it's something that is good for certain groups of people with limited opportunity cost, that they will accept a poor Republican representative rather than a good Democratic one. And that means you get more polarization in that political system. We think that's far worse because it means you get less political party accountability between the two for either of the parties. And we think that is also incredibly harmful in terms of the kinds of compromises you're able to achieve.
Okay.
Closing.
Yeah, Brynde, it's interesting you talk about Republicans potentially responding to Democratic deadlock. How did Republicans act within the Obama administration? And if we were not to show some sort of disincentive for that, how will they act in future Democratic administrations?
I think it's pretty clear that the Republicans have lost from the rise of Donald Trump as well, given that they are an establishment political party that has been divided by the rise of Donald Trump. It's not in their interest to create anti-establishment leaders either. That's what they've learned from this. But for us to use a tit-for-tat strategy only escalates the incentive for them to do it in the future, which means it might be bad for us that they did it in the past, but then if we do it, then they have an incentive to escalate in the future, and then it'll be bad for us in the future as well. Hanging parliaments is not a good way to create social progress or protect people's interests. Okay, then, finally what we tell you is that it reduces the ability for it to be acceptable for a Republican to swing on issues that in favor of the Democrats. That means the Democrats are less able to lobby your representative backbencher Republican in order to get some things through in the interim. That means, again, that you get less moderation, you get less compromise on issues that means that the way that issues are legislated for isn't a way that is representative of compromise for the public as a whole, but rather an ideology that is radical or polarized and isn't something that gets critical mass traction from the population. We think that's really bad. We've already told you why we think that Trump is very likely to compromise, analysis that goes unresponded to. What we tell you, in fact, is that Trump is presently upset that the Democrats were unwilling to work with him. He's extended the olive branch both in terms of his election acceptance speech and in terms of the kinds of concessions he made in his Trump care legislation. Those are attempts to work with the Democrats. We are the ones rejecting his deal making, not the other way around at the moment. We don't think there's a good principled reason to stand against Trump in a blanket way when the consequences of this is harming people like working class communities that have had the geography of their cities broken up, their jobs destroyed. We don't think that it's fair to harm them.
Mr. Speaker, the problem with opening opposition is that they are ahistorical in terms of the line of this power play and how it occurs. In the response of intractable Republican opposition, what they propose is democratic surrender and cooperation. And this is supposed to be some sort of disincentive for future Republican administrations to oppose future Democratic presidents in the same way they opposed under Obama. The response to that is supposed to say, yes, you have your way. We'll compromise with you as long as you don't bother compromising with us. That is the long-term disincentive in terms of what they do. So that's the first point that I'm going to bring, and it is the narrative extension, and is why they effectively, even if they're correct in some of the small power plays, lose the bigger picture. Secondly, what I want to tell you is one is manifestly in the electoral advantage of the Democrats, and why Democrats should do things which are in their electoral advantage, and thirdly, why even if there are one or two good things that Trump does, why we should oppose him at all costs on a principled level. Before that, a number of points of rebuttal. First thing I want to do is just point out some fake news, right? What the last speaker said, and the speaker before him, they've perpetuated this long-running anti-factual narrative that the white working class voted for Trump. The working class genuinely voted for Trump. That's untrue. In fact, if you look at the people who are in the lowest decile, the lowest quintile, the lowest people they voted for Clinton. If you want to get the people who voted for Trump, it's actually the people who are white and uneducated. But that's not necessarily people who are the lowest working class. That's some people who are just the section above that largely voted for Trump. Your plumbers, etc., who are actually relatively well off in terms of the demographics. That's what we're talking. We're not talking about surrendering the poor people. What they say to that as well, to get these people, what we need to do is to give some sort of compromise to Trump just to help them. They didn't give you any examples of the compromise. Let's look at exactly the sort of compromises that Trump offers. What he offered was a so-called watered-down version of alterations to Obamacare. Those watered-down alterations would have still disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of the very poorest at the bottom from actually cover under Obamacare. It would have put up the premiums for many of the people on the lowest quintiles. And at the same time, as linked to that legislation, he wanted to actually lower taxes and premiums for people at the top in terms of insurance. So that so-called watered down may have been less bad than what the Republicans would ideally like to get. But they can't get that ideal thing because we can block them in terms of filibusters. Instead, what they say is still get something which is bad, but not as bad as it could possibly be. So those so-called compromises would still make things far, far worse for those at the bottom that the Democrats want to assure. The next thing they say, especially when we PY Dave, and it's repeated with Brynde, who say, well, look, George, do you really think that the Democrats' problem is they're not radical enough after losing with an extremely moderate candidate? To which his response is incredibly flippant. No, I think they're idiots. No, that's not analysis, Mr. Speaker. What we actually think is that these people, what has happened is that the Democrats under Sanders, and as OG correctly points out, if they present a genuine radical alternative, we should that to be electorally successful. What happens, however, when we say to Trump, and as opening opposition characterised Trump being very magnanimous. You see, he wants to be the breaker of the system, he said. He wants to break Washington. At the point at which we say, yes, okay, we will give you some legislative victories, that means Trump can say, I was right. I did break the system. I got concessions from the system. That legitimises all of the other terrible things that Trump is actually doing. Things like the repealing of bans on gun violence, things like the lowering of taxes for the people at the very top, things like his foreign relations on Russia, Mr. Speaker. We think it legitimises all of those terrible things, which are not manifestly in the interest of America. Conversely, what we say is that actually, if you are able to provide a radical alternative and present Trump as unable to break the system, that breaks what he fundamentally is. His selling issue is, I am a bully for the small guy. I will help you in Washington. If he can't actually effect change, that makes Trump redundant in the eyes because it takes away the only thing which he actually has to play at. That's the problem. Now let's get to the substantive. Firstly, we say, even if they are right in some of the small-term issues in terms of whether or not Republicans will retaliate, let's look at what happened under the Obama administration. Despite the fact that Obama was very bipartisan, wanted to help bring through the Obamacare, etc. What we got was violent and frankly intractable opposition. Even his Supreme Court nominee, for example, Merrick, was blocked despite the fact that the Senate had a constitutional duty to let them through. The Republicans didn't let anything through. The Obama administration was seen as something of a lame duck, unable to get domestic legislation through. If we are to compromise with Trump now, what that says is when the Democrats get in and compromise, the Republicans have no disincentive. Why? Because Republican leaders tend to respect power. They tend to respect power plays. They know that if they're going to stop any legislation that goes through a Democratic president, and they're not going to get any response to that by stopping their legislation, they have no incentive to compromise in the future. What does that do? Over time, that drifts the legislative consensus of America to the right, as we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years. For example, under Clinton, we had higher taxes for the rich. We had bans on automatic machine guns. Under Obama, those things lapsed, but the Republicans didn't get any consensus for these to continue, any sort of compromise. We think that sort of thing will happen in the future. Secondly, what we see, this is manifestly to the advantage of the Democrats. Why? Despite what they say about polls saying his core base still supports him, Trump is now has the lowest approval ratings of any president basically in history. Then he's heading for a massive defeat at the midterms. What we say in that sense is that if you present yourself as a clear-cut opposition, as someone who has rejected something which is a clear disaster of an administration, that puts you in line to be the beneficiary of that discontent. Why? Because we look at the sort of things that Trump's doing. He's failed to get his Kelkev through. He's failed to get his ban through on immigrants. His wall is floundering, and for all of this, we see he's become extremely unpopular. That means the Democrats will be the recipients when it comes to the election. Moreover, we see because Trump's very angry, he's likely to lash out, and often his administration will become even more dysfunctional as he becomes more paranoid, is what tends to happen. We see, therefore, finally, it's important that we cast his entire presidency as an absolute failure. Because even if he does small things, like tries to keep jobs, as Brynde says, for people, and they say for people who they say represent the poor, the reality is that these are often destructive policies for the poor, because protectionism is often retaliating. We always see the Chinese want to retaliate on protectionism. This will hurt the poor in the long term. What this does is say that Trump actually helped the poor, despite the fact that his protectionist policies will likely lead to them losing jobs over the long term, even if he saves them in the short term. For all these reasons, we're very happy to say that that's fake news and very low energy.
No energy. The real burns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the very beginning of Trump's presidency, he came up with a 100-day plan. He explicitly put out certain goals and said, this is my contract with the American people, this is what I'm going to provide you. 100 days later, and I'm not exaggerating, Trump failed at every single one of those goals. And that is because the immense incompetence we are dealing with in this particular administration is one which, for the first time, has been an incompetence which defeats even the ideological divisions which exist. The DNC arrogance which drives CG would say that at this point is the time to go back to politicizing issues. I think the perfect example is that scene in the movie Troy, where they win one battle and then are trying to decide whether or not to try and crush them, and the warning Hector gives is that if you try to strike now, you will unite the base. That is something that Yash and I say we are not prepared to do, and we would rather have this incredibly disastrous presidency just play itself out. The important thing is how, number one, the Democratic Party reinvents itself in the interim, and secondly, whether the political dynamic which exists between the rest of the more rational Republicans and the people on the ground is one which can protect the most vulnerable people, where Yash and I are going to be focusing in extension. Before I do that, though, a bit more rebuttal. Number one, John says we are ahistorical because we're ignoring how intractable Republicans can be. Well, if you want to talk about history, this is the most divisive and least bipartisan time in American politics in history. And what they are saying is that you should make things more partisan, right? You should make the Democratic Party more extreme, which is to say, regardless of how much more Trump is forced to retreat, we will still keep opposing those things. And we say that if anything is ahistorical, it's their suggestion as to how we deal with this issue. But secondly, they do admit that the political spectrum has moved to the right quite a bit in the last 10 to 20 years. Yes, John. But how did the Republican Party move to the right? Through the rise of the Tea Party, building a big base within the Republican Party and saying, if you want our votes, you're going to have to appeal to us. But how did the Tea Party do that? How has Breitbart done that? That is a conception of Republican siege mentality, that no matter how much power they gain, they always have to be able to paint themselves as the victims. They always have to be able to paint the Democrats as the people who are crazy ideologues who will never compromise with us no matter what it is that they offer them. It makes it incredibly more likely that the Republican Party is going to continue, is going to be able to radicalize if you prove right the very people who said these politicians have no interest in working with us and adopting a blanket, we will oppose everything. But everything policy can only strengthen the siege mentality, which makes, importantly, which makes it more difficult for Republicans to humanize anybody who's protected by the Democrats. John says Trump voters aren't actually the poorest people, they're just the second poorest people. Well, they're the poorest people who matter because they're the poorest white people. They're the poorest people with political capital. The people at the very bottom, who are the blacks, who are the sexual minority, are such a small minority that unless you can get the bracket just above them to care about their humanity, right? Unless you can get the political division to not be so divisive that you can get the conscience of Republican voters to care, then it's not going to matter whether or not you're dealing with the most vulnerable voters in that instance. Thirdly, and who are Trump voters, John's like, you can't give these people what they want. What do they want? I'm going to say something brave here. I think Trump voters want nothing in particular, at least nothing that Trump is offering them legislatively. Because the political division right now is ideological more than it is legislative. It is driven by a hatred of the Democrats. It is driven by a hatred of this lack of bipartisan negotiation, something which you are only going to make worse. And the reason that there are many, many things on which you can have bipartisan cooperation and compromise, which we think the Democratic Party should be more willing to pursue. I want to talk on one more point of rebuttal because this is particularly important to me. They say that centrism has failed and Obama is a good example of that. Number one, Obama was legislatively probably the most successful president we've had in decades. But secondly, most of Obama's failures can be linked directly and unambiguously to racism. So things that Obama did, which Trump is doing now, you see like a tripling of support from Republicans. So if they say Obama failed, whereas Obama was able to get Obamacare across, something which Democrats have been trying to do for decades, by giving Republicans certain things, by making concessions on other things, by picking Merrick Garland, who was a centrist in the first place, Obama has shown that it is possible to be a deal maker in Washington, and if anything, it is that which the Democratic Party should embrace as a model for progress. Importantly, the understanding you need to have is that the humanization and an increase in bipartisan politics is not just about voters, right? And this is where we differ from opposition. It's also about how Americans see each other, right? About whether or not they see their well-being as people in a democratic society as being zero-sum necessarily. If Trump is given the opportunity to politicize his incompetence, to politicize his failings as blue versus red issues, then you're never going to have any incentive for the white Westerners who voted for Trump to also perhaps stop discriminating against people in the workplace. This, just in a second, this, increasing bifurcation of voters is also coinciding with the bifurcation and a decrease in tolerance over the last few years. And importantly, it is the idea that it is Washington versus the people, which creates the idea that we don't need to respond positively to the hope which the Obama administration was trying to get across. And yes, the racism contributed to failures there, but it's still important for us to teach people to recognize the humanity and meaningful compromise from the top down. Yes?
Will you deny the empirical truth that a more radical absolutist Democratic Party would have beat Trump?
No, actually, I'm a leftist too. I would have loved for Bernie to win, but number one, the Democratic Party rigged the primary so that Bernie never really had a chance. And maybe Clinton would have won anyway, but WikiLeaks shows that the DNC collaborated. So the Democratic Party never has and never will be the party of the left. But also, this radicalism is not something that you necessarily achieve by opposing everything Trump does, because if anything, it's not policies which are leftist in their nature that the Democratic Party is pushing. It's merely a matter of whether or not you're able to build meaningful working relationships in Washington, which is how legislative policy properly gets made. Yash and I recognize that this is about the general ideological approach with which people view politics, and that this is the only way to protect the vulnerable. We're very proud to oppose.
Well, thanks, actually, good knowledge. Welcome.
For the Democrats to do anything, the Democrats need to win. When Democrats systematically let Trump's cabinet choices through, their names and details were published online, and a groundswell of support came out in favor of pushing them out of the party and not voting for the Democrats. When the Democratic chair was the one who was not radical, when we elected Tom Perez rather than Keith Ellison as the Democratic chair, people left the party in droves. The Democratic Party needs to be more radical. If they're not more radical, they are going to lose. That is the simple proposition we bring you from Closing Government, with analysis as to why this is the case. We tell you that it is in the Democrats' long-term electoral future to block the Trump administration, and that this has long-term benefits for the incentives inherent in the system. I'm going to rehash that extension, but first some rebuttal. What we get from opening government is something I just want to get out of the way, this idea of deadlock and the problem of deadlock. I have three responses to this. Firstly, if Trump changes things, he's fucked anyway. Secondly, we disincentivize deadlock on our side of the House. We told you about how we need to punish the Republicans for their obstructionism and move forward into a system where we do actually see change happening. But thirdly, and this is incredibly important, we think stagnation is still preferable to terrible policies. I'm going to talk to you in a minute about how our analysis removes the ability for even a Democratic Party that stands against the Republicans to actually commit any change. And we think, moreover, that the US legislation just changes too much. Their tax law changes all the time. We'd probably prefer a system where it doesn't change as often. What we get from the closing opposition is this idea of uniting the base and a metaphor to Troy, which is a movie I haven't seen. Firstly, we'd say Trump isn't winning. Right? He's unpopular, we concede that, but so are the Democrats. They are both incredibly unpopular right now. What we need to do as the Democratic Party, and this is analysis John brings you that's thoroughly unresponded to, is make ourselves the beneficiaries of that discontent, rather than just driving down the number of people who vote and increasing apathy, so that we have the most unpopular two presidential candidates vying for the office of the President of the United States. Secondly, we haven't even won one battle against Troy. Republicans have rallied around Trump. The Republican establishment, even though he's not their guy they wanted, have rallied around him. We can't say that we've won one battle and now we need to keep fighting when we haven't even done that. The deep state has rallied around him. Thirdly, who decides elections? They write off John's analysis being oh, he only said that the second poorest group voted for Trump. The point is that the Latino voter base, the minorities voter base, decides elections. They are the most rapidly growing part of the American electorate. Elisha says we should ignore them in favor of a shrinking base, these white working class voters who are no longer deciding elections. The Democratic coalition is falling apart. We are losing these voters. What we need to do is exactly what is going to get them on our side, and we're going to talk about that in a second. They next say that the problem is how Americans see each other. We think race relations in such an America are already terrible. We need to empower minorities with something to rally around, rather than a lame duck Democratic Party. What's our extension? Why does it win us the debate? And rebuttal is interwoven here.
Why did Hillary Clinton lose the election? Why are the Democrats systematically failing as a party? When Tom Perez was elected as Democratic chair over Keith Ellison, people left the party in droves. When the cabinet choices of Trump went through relatively unopposed, people left the party in droves. The Democrats are seen as in bed with the establishment. That limits their ability to be a progressive party. People say they are just like the Republicans. There's no meaningful difference. How then do we distinguish these two parties? How do we get the Democrats' votes? Well, it's interesting that the closing opposition talks about the Tea Party. What did the Tea Party do to become so popular? The very thing we want the Democrats to be doing right now. Fundamentally, they were obstructionists. They didn't let the Democrats get away with anything. We don't want the Republicans to get away with anything. Why do the Democrats need votes? Well, the houses that we're talking about are incredibly close. The only reason that obstructionism works is because we have enough people to obstruct if we all stand together. At the point at which the Democrats bleed off votes because they're not being a proper opposition party, then blocking does absolutely nothing. The Republicans can get away with anything they want. That means that even if we buy analysis from the government that the Republicans are softening their policies just a little bit, we say they aren't, Trump is still building the wall, fake news from the government, they don't have to soften things anymore. They don't have to compromise. They can do whatever the hell they want because there's no opposition party to speak of. The two-party system in the US is in a balance. What we need to do is push and play the same game as the Republicans to keep that in place. It's no point trying to beat the Republicans in a game of chess when they're playing checkers against us. It's no point being the good guy and playing by the rules when the Republicans shirk their constitutional obligation to put in place a new member of the Supreme Court and block Merrick Garland for longer than it takes to gestate a child in the womb. Life was created in the time that it took Merrick Garland to stand there. Actually, I'll take Elisha.
Trump has had a 100-day losing streak, but the one place he did win was in the confirmation of Gorsuch, where the Republicans control the House and Senate and showed that they're prepared to change the rules of Parliament if there's something they care deeply enough about.
Exactly! If we lose power as the Democrats, they'll just push through more things like that. They will bully us. We won't be able to do anything. We need to play the game like they're playing the game. Next, we give analysis on how does this look like? Well, we think this opposition is a vibe, right? When there's filibusters, when we're opposing everything, that creates the groundswell of support that's missing in the Democratic Party. That makes it interesting to young voters, to the minority voters that are systematically leaving the party. Secondly, we also give you analysis that Trump just looks weak as hell if we do this. We remove his strongman power. That's a great way to fight the Republicans. We also said it changes long-term incentives in the system. Ludicrous for Elisha to suggest that Obama was the most successful legislative president when the Republicans outmaneuvered him on almost every conceivable front. Social security, Merrick Garland, guns. The Democrats need to punish the Republicans for their obstructionism. It's bad if one group only ever plays nice, while the other group only ever plays dirty. That isn't politics, that's bullying, that's walking all over the opposition. That also creates what John analyzes, which is the long-term shift to the right that we've been seeing happening in American politics. This debate is rarely simple, right? The Democrats need to do what it takes to get votes, to win elections. If they don't do that, they get walked all over. They can't put their fingers in their ears and hum to themselves, pretending that everyone's playing the game properly when they simply aren't. They have to play the game, they have to fight the Republicans, they have to get support by doing that, being radical, very proud to propose. Thank you.
Trump winning the election was tragic because it told us and showed us how divided the world is, that we are truly in an age of anger, intolerance, violence against minorities, and that age of anger is trickled down from the politics and the policies of the establishment itself. Jordan is correct. Everyone is unpopular. No one likes Trump. No one likes the Democrats. No one likes the Republicans, because they've consistently prioritized politics above the needs and lives of the everyday people. The reality is that we are at a crossroads. The president is the weakest president in history, and the Republicans don't support him. The Democrats don't support him. And finally, after years of bipartisanship, or partisanship, of intolerance, of non-collaboration. We can have one opportunity to extend a hand to the Republican Party and say, we will work with you for the betterment of the American people. How do we achieve partisan collaboration, and how do we protect the democratic voter? No, thank you. Future political compromise. Which policies are they going to compromise on? Probably tax. That's what everyone wants, to redistribute to ensure that people have access. Good quality healthcare and education that reflects the needs and wills of the people. And the reality is that those do need some reform. The education system is crumbling under a system of poor funding. And in order for collaboration to get better policies which are essential, we need to do so. Will Trump compromise? Probably. He's isolated. He hasn't achieved much. He wants to do something. Trump will extend a hand to the Democratic Party because it's in his self-interest. We don't think that's controversial. What we do think is controversial in this debate is we've seen interactions between two sides to say, how will Trump react to this? Will Trump demonize and scapegoat the Democrats as being obstructionist if we pass this policy, as we've heard on the opposition? Or will, as Trump say, I was right, the establishment loves me? That seems like an odd stance for Trump to take if he positioned himself as anti-establishment, right? So at the point at which Trump can say, the Democrats love me, I am collaborating with them, that doesn't place him at a position of power, John, if his majority electorate are bigoted individuals who potentially hate the Democrats. To say, I needed the Democrats, is not a powerful thing for Trump to say. So I think that spin was a little weak. So Trump is likely to compromise, and he's likely to demonize and scapegoat the Democrats as obstructionist on their sides, as opposed to that. So we think, at that point, it's worse under our side of the house, under their side of the house. Will this teach Republicans a lesson? Let's wrap them on the wrists, because those bitches have been obstructing us for generations. Like that eye for an eye strategy hasn't resulted in collective blindness and ignorance, metaphorically and probably literally. Because cyclical deprivation, to say to people who have obstructed you, we will hate you even more, doesn't make them change their mind and say, oh yeah, I'm gonna respond with tolerance and respect. This is the opportunity for the Democrats to do that, to say, this is how we will change things and end the cycle of deprivation and deadlock by compromising. The reality is that the Republicans are doing this. They didn't vote for Trump care. They kept Obamacare in, even though they had the majority. The reality is that Republicans are compromising. They're not defending their president, and that's the signal that the Democrats should step in to protect them as well. What about future elections, swing voters, moderates on the opening half? Well, moderates want nothing to do with Trump. We hate Trump. Moderates want good policies. Which one is more likely? Well, moderates want good policies because they are poorer people. They could be disenfranchised white people, black people who didn't vote, or Latino people who didn't vote in the first place. The reality is if they wanted so much to hate Trump, why didn't they vote in the first place for their candidate? It's because they hate the system. And the system is obstructionist. So at the point at which you reinforce the obstructionist nature of the system, those voters don't vote anymore, continue not to vote, and the moderates in those swing states don't work. You don't get radicalization of the Democratic Party. You get apathy in the Democratic Party, where they no longer prioritize the well-being of the people within that party. How do we protect the Democratic voter? And this was our extension. Who are they? They're minorities. They're the economically disenfranchised. They're people who have visited violence upon every day. And what does this say to people who voted for Trump if the Democrats are obstructionist in this way? They say, we, as the Democrats, stand against any attempt you had to improve your lives. We stand against your insecurity, your declining livelihood, your joblessness. Your identity is nothing to us. We relish your defeat. That narrative, where the Democrats act with hatred, as Jordan says, the Democrats hate everything to do with the Democratic Party, is not only what harms interaction between them, it says to the man on the ground who voted for the Republican Party, you are not wanted by liberals in this country, and that means they act out. That means they entrench their bigotry, their backlash, their inability to compromise, and that's when you harm Democrat voters on the ground, the black people who are attacked within the United States, the people who are visited upon with discrimination. If the Democratic Party values Democratic voters, it must undermine the narrative which bolsters the far right, which bolsters the idea that liberalism is only for the few elite, that liberalism cannot be something that's inclusive and collaborative. And that's what we think is the nature of the harm to the everyday person. We talked a lot about politics. But if we don't do this, you harm the democratic individual on the ground who has violence subjected upon them when you reinforce the narrative of the Republican Party itself. I'll take opening, yes.
Voters of the Democratic Party are currently protesting to the streets in absolute defiance of Trump. Why shouldn't their party represent their views?
They're not protesting because they hate Trump. They're protesting because they wanted a world in which people could live together and in collaboration. And that's the reality that we wanted. They didn't want not Trump. They wanted democratic, liberal principles to go through. And if that is the trade-off, do we hate Trump? Do we want good liberal policies? We think the choice is obvious to every democratic voter. Pankaj Mishra wrote the book Age of Anger, and he's right. The reality of our everyday life is anger and intolerance, and the only way we can change that is if politicians step up to the plate and say, we are responsible for a lot, but we will compromise for the interests of our people, and we will compromise for better policies, but also so we do not empower people to visit violence upon others, where we are inclusive, where we say that our party stands for everyone. All right, so we achieve two things: partisan collaboration, and more importantly, we protect the democratic voter.